lost all ability to claim that we didn't know, that we weren't sure, because that was the year that our governments decided we had to act. So what else was happening in 1988? Well, it was the year that Canada and the United States signed the first free trade agreement that was eventually expanded into NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which became the model for all these free trade agreements that have proliferated around the world. And we know the tenets of neoliberalism: privatization, deregulation, cuts to taxes for the wealthy and the corporations, paid for with austerity for everybody else. All of it locked in with these corporate free trade deals that makes it so very hard to change. As you know, when the rules of trade were being written, we could have decided on different priorities. We could have decided on a development model that was low emission. We had that opportunity. But instead, our politicians did something pretty sneaky, which is they made sure that if it ever came down to it, that trade would always trump climate. And it was so clear that this fact is actually written into the UN Climate Treaty that is the basis for all of these negotiations that was signed in Rio in 1992. That agreement states that, quote, measures taken to combat climate change, including unilateral ones, should not constitute a disguised restriction on international trade. So it said that explicitly, and very similar language was put into the Kyoto Protocol. So what was being said is you can talk about whatever you want about the need to do something about climate change, but if it ever comes down to it, trade trumps climate. I live in Toronto, Ontario, and we're lucky in Ontario that our government introduced a pretty bold climate policy in the midst of the financial crisis in 2009. So our government introduced a green energy plan, which was the boldest in North America. It pledged to get our province off of coal completely by 2014, but to do so in a way that would create huge numbers of manufacturing jobs. So they introduced a feed-in tariff and also a requirement that 40 to 60% of the technology used, of the green technology used, had to be made in Ontario. It created 31,000 jobs very, very quickly. And it was a success. Many workers who had lost their jobs in auto plants got jobs making solar panels. This is the essence of a just transition. So everything was going well until we were challenged at the World Trade Organization by the European Union and Japan, who said that this was discrimination against their right to unfettered free trade and access to markets. And the WTO ruled against us. Trade trumps climate. So we were overturned. Quebec, under huge pressure from social movements, has probably the most powerful environmental movement, or one of the most powerful environmental movements in our country, won one of the very first bans on fracking. Do we have a few Quebecers in here? Yes, they were ahead of France. They were ahead of France. And then Quebec was challenged under NAFTA, under one of these investor rights clauses that allows multinational corporations to sue governments. They were sued by a company called Lone Pine for their lost profits because this apparently infringed on their rights to frack for gas under the St. Lawrence River. And the trick was, the really clever part, was that this was actually a Canadian company that just incorporated itself in the US and pretended to not be Canadian so that it could sue its own government. So this is how these trade deals work against the types of victories that we know that we have been winning, against the Keystone XL pipeline, against Arctic drilling, against fracking here in France. against coal mining in Germany. This is where we have to move precisely because our governments won't lead. But we have to understand that corporations, as we win, are going to be using these trade deals as tools against us, and we can't let them do it. We have to respect one another. We have to respect the people who are the original caretakers of our land, water, and air, who have a different worldview that is not based just on taking, but is based on caretaking for one another, for the earth. We have to say no to what we don't want. We have to say no to those carbon bombs, and there's going to be actions in April and May find out about them in your own countries. We have to say no to these trade deals that put us all in danger, and at the same time, we have to say yes to the world we not only want, but the world that so many need, that is our only and best